The enemy fleet drifted in the cold darkness of space, their warships forming an iron blockade around the sector. The admiral of the Ivanti Empire, Vector, stared at the holographic display with narrowed eyes. Another patrol had gone silent. Another group of ships had simply vanished. No wreckage, no distress calls, nothing. It was as if space itself had swallowed them. The bridge of the command vessel was silent except for the hum of power cores and the quiet tapping of control panels. The officers were tense, their eyes flickering between their screens and their leader. The reports made no sense. The sector was supposed to be empty, devoid of any human military presence. The invasion of the Terran colonies had been swift and decisive. Humanity had no fleet left to fight with. And yet something was out there, carrying through their forces like a phantom in the dark. "Admiral." A young officer spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We are receiving a transmission. It is not from any of our ships." Vector frowned. "Play it." A burst of static filled the bridge before a voice, deep and calm, echoed through the speakers. "You should have left Earth alone." A shiver ran through the crew. Vector clenched his jaw. The signal had no source. It was bouncing off their own relays, as if the enemy was inside their network. He turned to his communications officer. "Track it. Find out where it's coming from." We can't," the officer admitted, hands shaking as he worked the controls. "The signal is everywhere and nowhere. It's using our own systems against us." The admiral's claws dug into the armrest of his chair. This was impossible. No human ship could penetrate their security, let alone infiltrate their fleet's communications. But something was out there. A sudden alarm blared. "Admiral!" Another officer shouted. "Warship Zyra 12 just vanished from the grid." "What do you mean vanished?" Vector snapped. "No explosions, no escape pods, just gone." The crew's unease turned to fear. Ships didn't just disappear. There was always wreckage, energy signatures, something. But here, there was nothing. Then the radar flickered. Just for a second. A blip. Something massive had entered the sector, but had disappeared just as quickly. "Impossible," an officer whispered. "Cloaking?" another suggested, but Vector shook his head. "No known technology can do that. Not even ours." And then it happened again. Another ship blinked off their scanners. A Ivanti cruiser, armed to the teeth, simply ceased to exist. Panic spread across the bridge. Officers scrambled to make sense of what was happening, but there was no explanation. A dark realization settled over Vector. This wasn't an ambush. This wasn't a typical battle. This was something far worse, something playing with them. "Send a distress signal to High Command," he ordered. "Now." The communications officer pressed the emergency sequence, but the console flickered and died. The transmission failed. "No, no, no, no," the officer muttered, desperately trying again. "We've lost control of our own systems." Another transmission cut through the silence. The same voice as before. Calm. Cold. There is no escape. A deep hum resonated through the fleet, a low vibration that sent static across their displays. And then, out of the void, it appeared. The Phantom. It was no ordinary ship. It was a behemoth of steel and darkness, its form barely visible against the endless night of space. It moved without sound, without warning. There were no recorded blueprints of any human vessel matching its size or design. It should not exist. And yet it was here. "Fire everything," Vector roared. The Ivanti fleet unleashed their might. Torpedoes, plasma beams, and kinetic rounds surged forward, seeking to tear the Phantom apart. The weapons struck, but nothing happened. The ship was still there, unscathed. And then it struck back. In a single instant, 3 Ivanti battleships exploded in a cascade of fire. The Phantom did not fire conventional weapons. There were no visible turrets, no launchers. The attacks seemed to come from the ship itself, bending reality around it. One by one, The Ivanti fleet fell. Some ships were torn apart. Others simply vanished, their fates unknown. Vector's heart pounded as he watched his proud armada crumble before his eyes. His empire had faced many enemies before, but nothing like this. This was not just a battleship. It was something more. It was a nightmare given form. You said. The Ivanti fleet was in chaos, ships scattered in every direction, trying to escape the unseen force that was tearing them apart. Vector stood frozen, his mind refusing to accept what he was witnessing. The phantom ship had no official record. No intelligence report had ever mentioned humanity possessing such a vessel. And yet, here it was, moving like a ghost, striking with impossible precision. "Admiral," an officer yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "We've lost contact with the outer perimeter ships. They're gone." Vector gritted his teeth. Gone. He slammed his fist onto the control panel. "Give me something. Energy signatures, warp trails, anything." The officer's hands trembled as he worked frantically. "There's nothing." It's like they were never here. The remaining Ivanti ships tried to regroup, forming defensive lines. But it didn't matter. The Phantom was already among them. It didn't move like a normal warship. There were no acceleration burns, no inertia, just sudden, precise jumps. 1 second, it was in the distance. The next, it was cutting through a destroyer at impossible speed. Vector watched in horror as the massive Ivanti dreadnought Krazel unleashed a full barrage of plasma lances. The energy beams roared through space, converging on the Phantom. But before impact, the ship flickered, like a mirage. The blasts passed harmlessly through it. What is this?" one of the officers stammered. "That's impossible." Vector's claws dug into the armrest of his chair. No ship can phase out of reality. His mind raced for an answer. The only logical conclusion was that this wasn't just a ship. It was a weapon designed to break the enemy before the battle even started. Psychological warfare at its finest. The Phantom didn't fight like a normal battleship. It hunted. Another flash. Another ship was gone. The Ivanti pilots, elite warriors who had conquered countless worlds, were now screaming in panic. Some ships fired wildly, their weapons missing the target entirely. Others tried to flee, only to be cut down before they could jump to warp. Then, a new sound filled the bridge. Laughter. Cold, quiet laughter over the communications channel. Vector's blood turned to ice. "Who is this?" he demanded. The voice was human, but distorted, mechanical. "We were never supposed to exist," it said. "You made sure of that." Vector felt his throat tighten. "What do you mean?" "You thought we were weak, that we had no warships left. You thought you won before the war even started." The voice was calm, almost amused. "You never asked what happened to the ones who refused to surrender." A realization struck Vector like a physical blow. This ship, it wasn't built by Earth's official government. It was never part of any fleet registry. This was something else, something born out of desperation, hidden from prying eyes. A rogue creation built in secret by those who had nothing left to lose. And now, it was here to deliver vengeance. "Admiral," a terrified officer yelled. "The Phantom. It's charging." Before Vector could react, the ship surged forward. It didn't fire weapons. It didn't need to. It passed through the Ivanti flagship as if it were a ghost. For a brief moment, everything was silent. Then, the flagship split apart, detonating in a violent explosion. The Phantom flickered out of existence once more, leaving behind only wreckage and terrified survivors. And the enemy finally understood. This was no ordinary war. This was the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt the Ivanti Empire forever. You said. The battlefield was silent. The wreckage of the once mighty Ivanti fleet drifted in the cold abyss of space, scattered remnants of what had been an unstoppable force. Fires still burned within some of the twisted hulls, but most had been snuffed out by the vacuum. The few remaining Ivanti ships, crippled and terrified, drifted aimlessly, their crews too stunned to act. Vector's command vessel was one of the few that had survived the Phantom's onslaught. The Admiral stood in the shattered remains of his bridge, staring at the destruction around him. His officers were either dead, unconscious, or too frightened to meet his gaze. He had never felt this kind of fear before, an enemy that did not obey the rules of war, a ship that defied reality itself. Then the screens flickered. A shadow moved across them, shifting like a specter. A deep hum vibrated through the ship's hull, as if something vast and unseen was watching them. "Admiral," one of the surviving officers whispered, "it's still here." Vector swallowed hard. He had no reinforcements, no escape routes, no hope. The Phantom had let them live. For now. But why? A new transmission cut through the silence. That same distorted voice, calm and deliberate. "You didn't expect to lose, did you?" Vector clenched his fists. "Who are you?" The voice ignored his question. "You thought humanity was finished, that we had nothing left." A pause. Then the voice continued, darker now. "Do you know what happens when you take everything from someone? When you erase their homes, their families?" Vector didn't answer. He already knew. "They build something that should not exist," the voice said. "Something that should never have been made." The Phantom reappeared. Not on the radar, not through conventional means, but on their own systems. It flickered into view, a ghostly silhouette looming just beyond the remains of the fleet. It wasn't just a ship, it was something else, something that felt alive. "This isn't possible," one of the officers whispered. Vector turned sharply. "We are the Ivanti Empire. We do not bow to fear." A cold laugh echoed through the speakers. "Then why are you shaking, Admiral?" Vector realized his hands were trembling. The Phantom moved again, faster than anything should be capable of. 1 second it was far, the next it was directly in front of them. No engine trails, no acceleration. It simply was. A cold wave of horror passed through the bridge. Then the lights flickered. The screens glitched, and something far worse happened. The Phantom was inside their systems. The main display changed, showing lines of corrupted code, numbers rearranging in real time. One by one, the remaining Vivanti ships powered down, their engines failing. "Admiral," an officer screamed, "our weapons are offline. We've lost control." The Phantom had taken their fleet hostage. And then the voice returned. No longer distorted, no longer calm. This time, it was filled with cold, seething rage. "You took our world from us. Now we take everything from you." The lights shut off completely. The hum of the ship's systems faded into silence. And in that moment, Admiral Vector understood. They had not just lost a battle. They had awakened something far worse than war. The silence was unbearable. Admiral Vector stood frozen in the darkness of his bridge, his breathing shallow. The hum of the ship's systems was gone, the comforting presence of control and power ripped away in an instant. The Phantom had done something no enemy had ever accomplished before. It had severed the Vivanti fleet from its own technology. The lights, the screens, the very heartbeat of the ship had been stolen away, leaving them blind, deaf, and helpless. The bridge crew trembled in their seats. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. It was as if they feared that even the smallest sound would summon the Phantom's wrath. Then the voice returned. "You always thought yourselves untouchable." It was a whisper now, quiet yet deafening in the absolute stillness. "You were wrong." Vector's jaw clenched. He was an admiral of the Ivanti Empire. He had led fleets that crushed entire civilizations. He had been called a war master, a conqueror. He would not be reduced to a trembling fool in the dark. He took a step forward, glaring at the dead monitors as if willing them back to life. "What do you want?" His voice was steady, but he could feel the fear creeping into his bones. The voice did not answer immediately. Then the screens flickered to life, but they did not show system data. Instead, images appeared. Earth, before the war. Towering cities, Blue oceans, green fields, then fire, the Ivanti invasion. Cities turned to ash, skies blackened with smoke, billions wiped out. You started this war, the voice said. You thought it would be easy, that we would break. The images changed again. Human ships, destroyed, overwhelmed. The remnants of Earth's defenses crushed under Ivanti fire. Then, a new scene. Humans in exile, in hiding. Factories built in secret, deep in asteroid belts and the shadows of dead worlds. Ships unlike any before, forged in desperation and vengeance. The birth of the Phantom. You never asked what happened to the ones who refused to die. The voice continued, cold and sharp. You should have. Vector's hands tightened into fists. You think one ship will change the outcome of this war. He forced himself to sound confident. You may have won this battle, but the Empire will not fall so easily. You are still outnumbered, outmatched. You cannot stop us. The voice laughed, low and humorless. You think this is about numbers. The images shifted again. Ivanti worlds, bustling trade hubs, military outposts, home planets filled with billions of lives. Then a shadow fell over them. Vector felt his stomach tighten. No, it couldn't be. The Phantom was not alone. We were never fighting for survival, the voice whispered. We were preparing for revenge. And then the horror became real. The screens exploded with data, distress signals from Ivanti colonies, panicked messages from commanders, reports of unknown vessels striking deep within Ivanti territory. These were not the sleek warships of humanity's past. These were ghosts in the dark, ships that did not exist on any register, that left no trails, that attacked with surgical precision. Vector's breath caught in his throat. The Phantom was only the beginning. You burned our world, the voice said, the quiet rage now unmistakable. Now we burn yours. And with that, the power returned. The screens flickered back to their original systems. The lights hummed to life. The ship's controls were restored. But it no longer mattered, because the war had already changed, and the Ivanti Empire was no longer the hunter. It was the prey. You said. The alarms screamed through the Ivanti warship, but Admiral Vector barely heard them. His mind was still trapped in the horror of what he had just witnessed. The Phantom wasn't just a single ship. It was the herald of something far worse. Humanity had not been destroyed. It had evolved into something the Ivanti never anticipated. Admiral, one of his officers shouted, frantically pressing at the controls. We're back online. But it doesn't matter, another whispered. His voice was hollow, filled with the same dread that Vector himself felt. They're already here. The screens displayed what should have been an impossibility. Dozens of new signals flickered into existence. They weren't just around the battlefield. They were everywhere, hidden in asteroid belts, lurking in the dark voids between planets, positioned deep within Ivanti-controlled space. The Phantom had been the first, but it was not alone. There were more, many more, and they had been waiting. A new transmission cut through the noise, the same voice that had haunted them since the battle began. You thought we had nothing left. A pause. You were wrong. Vector clenched his fists. This changes nothing, he growled, forcing the fear out of his voice. The Ivanti Empire has ruled the stars for centuries. We have fleets, armies. You cannot possibly believe a handful of ghost ships will. Who said anything about a handful? The officer manning the scanners gasped. His hands trembled as he turned toward Vector. Admiral, we're detecting thousands. Vector's blood turned to ice. That's impossible. And yet, the proof was right in front of him. The ships emerging from the void weren't conventional warships. They weren't marked on any galactic registry. They had no official designations. They were all like the Phantom, silent, invisible to normal scans, weapons beyond anything that Ivanti had ever faced. They had existed in the shadows for years, unseen, unknown. Until now. You should have finished the job, the voice said, and for the first time, Vector realized something else. It wasn't just a man speaking to him. There was something collective about the way it spoke, as if it wasn't just one voice, but many, overlapping, resonating with the same burning rage. You took our home from us, the voice continued. So we became something else, something you cannot fight, something you cannot see. On the screen, the Ivanti capital world appeared. Vector's stomach twisted into knots as he saw the impossible. The Shadow Fleet had already reached it. The Ivanti homeworld, the very heart of the Empire, was surrounded, and no one had even noticed. "Admiral," another officer whispered, his voice barely holding together. They bypassed all of our defenses, our fleets, our planetary shields. They didn't even detect them. Vector's mouth was dry. "How?" The voice gave a low, humorless chuckle. "You underestimated us," it said. "And now you will pay the price." A single command echoed through the transmission. "Burn it down." And the screen filled with fire. One by one, the shadow ships unleashed their wrath. Ivanti defense stations crumbled under their firepower. Planetary shields, thought to be impenetrable, shattered like glass. Cities that had stood for millennia erupted in flame, entire districts swallowed by energy bombardments before anyone could react. It wasn't just destruction. It was vengeance. The Phantom had been their warning. And now, the Ivanti were watching their empire die in real time. Vector staggered back, his mind refusing to accept what was happening. The Ivanti had never known fear. They had always been the conquerors, the rulers, the strongest. But now, they were the ones screaming for help. He turned to his officers, searching for any sign of resistance, anything they could do to stop this. But all he saw were hollow expressions, faces drained of all hope. The war was over. The Ivanti had already lost, and humanity was here to make sure they never forgot it. Admiral Vector had seen planetary bombardments before. He had ordered them himself. He had watched civilizations crumble under Ivanti firepower, entire species erased from history with the push of a button. But never, not once, had he imagined that his people would be on the receiving end of such destruction. The Ivanti homeworld, the proud jewel of the Empire, burned before his eyes. The Phantom Fleet had struck without mercy. Entire cities, military bases, command centers, all turned to ruin in mere minutes. The planetary shields had been useless, their technology decades behind whatever the humans had developed in their exile. Ivanti defenses had not even slowed them down. On the bridge of his warship, Vector could hear his crew breaking. Some whispered prayers to the gods of conquest, others sat in silence, their minds shattered by the reality before them. These were battle-hardened soldiers, warriors who had raised worlds. And now, they were powerless. "Sir," one of the officers choked, barely able to speak. Our fleets across the galaxy, they're all reporting attacks. It's not just here." Vector turned sharply, his eyes dark with disbelief. "What?" The officer swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he pulled up the data. "The humans, they didn't just come for our capital. They struck everywhere. Simultaneously, on the main screen, chaos unfolded across the Empire. Ivanti strongholds were vanishing under the Phantom Fleet's wrath. Entire sectors were lost, their defenses overrun by ships that didn't officially exist. Battle stations meant to withstand decades of siege fell in hours. It was not war. It was execution. The transmission returned, and the voice spoke again. No longer a whisper in the dark. Now, it was the sound of justice. "This was never about victory," it said. "This was about making sure you never rise again." Vector's hands clenched into fists. His empire, his people, everything they had built over centuries, it was vanishing before his eyes. "We can negotiate," he said, voice strained. "We can." No. The cold finality in that single word sent a chill down his spine. The screen shifted, showing something new. Ivanti citizens, fleeing through burning streets, their once invincible military leaders now among them, running in terror, and among the chaos, the looming shadows of human war machines, tanks, walkers, drones. The ground forces had landed. "They aren't just destroying our fleet," an officer whispered. "They're occupying." Vector realized the truth too late. Humanity was not just erasing the Ivanti from power. They were replacing them. A brutal understanding settled over him. The humans were not here for revenge alone. They had come to reshape the galaxy, to ensure that no empire like the Ivanti would ever exist again. And the Phantom had been only the beginning. Across the Ivanti homeworld, surrender beacons flickered to life. Some commanders, realizing the inevitable, laid down their arms. Others, still clinging to pride, fought until their last breath. But it didn't matter. The outcome was already decided. The Ivanti Empire, which had once ruled the stars, was gone, and humanity stood in its place. The transmission crackled one final time, and the voice delivered the last words Vector would ever hear as an admiral of the Ivanti fleet. "You thought you were the future." A pause. "You were only the past." And then the screen went dark. The war was over. Humanity had won. The silence on the bridge of Admiral Vector's warship was suffocating. His crew, his once proud warriors, sat motionless, watching their empire collapse. The Ivanti homeworld burned, its defenses shattered. Across the galaxy, strongholds of their dominion fell one by one. And above it all, the Phantom fleet loomed, an unbreakable shadow cast over the remnants of their civilization. Vector clenched his fists, his claws digging into his palm. He had served the Empire for over a century, believing in its eternal strength. But now he faced the impossible truth. The Ivanti were no longer rulers. They were prey. A final transmission flickered onto the screen. This time, the voice was not a single man, nor a mere message of war. It was something greater, something final. A human face appeared, weathered, scared, eyes hardened by loss. He wore no military insignia, no symbols of rank. He did not need them. The authority in his voice was absolute. "This is not an offer. It is not a request. The Ivanti Empire is no more." Vector bared his teeth. "You can destroy our fleets, burn our cities, but you will never erase us. We will rise again." The human merely tilted his head. "No," he said, his voice filled with something deeper than hatred. "You won't." The screen flickered, showing Ivanti colonies, once thriving, now in flames. The humans had not simply conquered, they had rewritten history itself. The Ivanti had spent centuries enslaving and exterminating lesser races, believing themselves untouchable. But now, the galaxy watched as they became the victims of their own arrogance. The human continued. "Your people have two choices: surrender or vanish into the void. There will be no negotiations, no second chances." Vector's rage boiled over. "You dare to dictate terms to us? We are warriors." "We." "You were." The human interrupted. "Now, you are nothing." And the transmission ended. A terrible silence followed. Vector turned to his officers, expecting resistance, defiance, something. But instead, he saw only fear. Some refused to meet his gaze. Others whispered among themselves, as if already accepting what came next. And then the worst thing of all happened. One by one, surrender signals began appearing across the remnants of the Ivanti fleet. Admirals, generals, planetary governors, all of them throwing down their arms. Entire sectors of the Empire, submitting to human rule without a fight. "Sir," an officer said, voice shaking. "The Council, they've surrendered." Vector stood frozen. The highest rulers of the Empire, the ones who had led their people to conquest, had surrendered before he could even issue a command. The war had not only been lost, it had never been winnable. His claws trembled as he looked at the main screen one last time. The Phantom ships had stopped firing. They no longer needed to. The Ivanti were no longer a threat. They were finished, and humanity had taken their place. For the first time in his life, Admiral Vector felt something he had never known before: despair.